charge of the meeting, I guess.
Morning.
Good morning.
Hi, Jane. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you. We have Walt. Hi, David. Hi, Bart. Good morning to you.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Hi, Bart.
Good morning.
Hi, Ann.
Good morning.
Hi, Walt.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning on a Saturday. We promise that we will be done before the weather gets up in the 50s so you guys can get out there and enjoy the day. But we're very excited to welcome you to our Northeast Wisconsin Land Trust winter event, where we are excited to share with you the state of our birds and have a fun conversation about how our birds are doing and how we can help them. So to start off, my name is Kayla Rouse. I am a proud board member of the Northeast Wisconsin Land Trust, and it's my pleasure to host this today. As a biologist and someone who studied conservation of birds in college, I am equally excited to welcome Craig Thompson today to be our speaker. So before we get going, just a few housekeeping items on Zoom. If you have not joined a Zoom event before, you will start to see our presentation show up. If you want to change your view and watch the speaker instead of the presentation, you can go to the top right to the button that says view, and you can switch back and forth between looking at the speaker and looking at the slides. This event will be recorded, just so you're aware, so that we can share it with more people later on. And we ask that you please mute while the speaker is speaking so that we can give him his platform. But if you do have questions, you can type them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer those at the end of the meeting. And at the end of the meeting, we will invite you to unmute and ask your questions directly to the presenter. So with that, I would like to start by just sharing a little bit about the Northeast Wisconsin Land Trust. I know many of you are long-term supporters, and we thank you so much for joining us this morning, but maybe some of you are new to the Land Trust. So at the Land Trust, we preserve land. And our mission is to preserve land to protect water, landscapes, and natural habitats for all the life on this planet, as well as our own enjoyment. You can see in the image here on the right-hand side, that black outline is our service area. So we work to preserve land in that entire black outline, all of which sits within the basin of the Lake Michigan watershed. So we have a lot of very important habitat within that watershed. To date, we have protected over 6,000 properties, many of which are public preserves that you can visit anytime. If you're in the Fox Valley, we invite you to visit the Strobe Island Marsh in Neenah, where you'll be able to see one of the last remaining cattail marshes on the Fox River system. But today we wanted to highlight our Green Bay properties. Craig is going to speak to the birds that use these properties and how important they are for migration. So we invite you to visit our Weekrear Creek, Red Banks sites up in Green Bay. And finally, our mission is really conservation that connects. So we're excited to have you here today to connect with the work that we do and learn more about birds and how important they are in Northeast Wisconsin and these lands that we are so passionate about. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker. Craig Thompson is our speaker today. He comes to us from the Wisconsin DNR, the Bureau of Natural Heritage Conservation. He holds a master's in zoology and physiology, And for over 30 years, he has worked with the Department of Natural Resources, specializing in migratory bird conservation and protected areas management. So we hope you enjoy his presentation today about the state of our birds.
Thanks, Kayla. I appreciate it. And as we get started, I want to thank not only Kayla, but also Linda Sheely and Stephanie Vrabik for a considerable amount of effort that went into organizing this event this morning. I'm delighted to be here and share with you some exciting information about birds and bird conservation. So with that, the state of our birds. There is little doubt, if you're watching the headlines these days, even the 6 o'clock news on some occasion, that we are in the midst of a global extinction crisis, the likes of which civilization has not ever seen. In fact, it has literally been considered an existential threat. And, you know, I get asked this question a lot, well, gosh, isn't climate change an equally significant problem or even more so? And from my perspective, climate change and extinction are two sides of the same coin. But when I look at the relative impacts of each, I'm more concerned professionally about the extinction crisis simply because, at least theoretically, climate change is reversible, whereas extinction is not. And we need all of these species that hold our ecological systems together to keep these systems vibrant in order for us to be able to respond to climate change that is ongoing and in some respects accelerating. So both very important problems and different strategies that are being employed to address each. And what we want to focus on today is the extinction crisis that is actually global in nature. Our birds, it turns out, sadly, are literally disappearing. You may or may not have noticed that every year there are fewer birds coming back. And in fact, an analysis of the data since 1970 indicates that more than 2.9 billion birds have disappeared over the decades. That is almost 30% of all birds that have occurred in North America historically. So what we're seeing is a continued downward trend for many species. Some, like robins and grackles, believe it or not, are also declining. So it's not just rare species, but it's also once common species and some that are still common that are declining quite significantly. So we're concerned because birds are such strong environmental barometers that they indicate that things are awry in the environment. But likewise, that also gives us a heads up that there are things that we can do. In fact, actions we need to take. So what's driving these bird losses? Well, there are three major factors and a number of lesser factors that are all conspiring to drive bird numbers downward. The first and the most significant is habitat loss and degradation. It occurs every day, and in fact, in many areas, it's accelerating. And without habitat, you simply don't have birds. The second largest source of bird mortality, believe it or not, are window strikes. And I suspect all of you have experienced window strikes on your windows. I know I certainly have. And this gives you an example of the magnitude of the problem, with an estimate of almost 1 billion birds a year dying on windows annually. What we see here is a situation where these are birds that were killed with a collision with a single building in Galveston, Texas on a single night in May. And so you can imagine if a single building during May migration has this kind of impact, multiply that by tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of buildings and millions of homes, and you start to get a feel for the scope of the issue. The third most significant source of bird mortality is free-ranging cats. And don't get me wrong, I think cats are wonderful animals, but a cat outside is a bird killer, and in fact, a wildlife killer. And so we really need people who are cat owners to keep cats indoors. It's as simple as that. It's better for wildlife, and it's honestly much healthier for the cat as well. So that sets the stage then for a variety of strategies which have been launched to try to address not only this global extinction crisis, but more specifically, the loss of birds. That is, again, the greatest, perhaps most visible manifestation of the extinction crisis. So what's cooking out there? Let's take a quick look at a couple of large initiatives. The first is called the Half Earth Project, and it's a construct from the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation. E.O. Wilson, for those of you who aren't familiar with him, is perhaps the most prominent conservation biologist on the planet, author of many books and in important ecological theories. He has since transitioned into one of the Earth's greatest advocates. And what the Half Earth Project advocates for is exactly what it stands for, and that is half Earth for the rest of life. The calculations from folks in the E.O. Wilson Foundation indicate that if we can save half of the land mass and half of our marine resources for wildlife and for fisheries, we're likely to retain about 80% of the species that currently inhabit the Earth. And again, those species help hold our ecological systems together. They're incredibly important for ecosystem function, and functional ecosystems are what provide ecosystem services that enable our survival. An equally ambitious but even more accelerated approach is the Weiss Foundation Campaign for Nature. And the Weiss Foundation Campaign for Nature shorthand is simply known these days as 30 by 30. We want to protect 30% of the planet's land and 30% of the marine resources by 2030, a mere 9 years from now. And those metrics have been established because of the severity of the extinction crisis that we're dealing with. We know that we literally have a closing window of opportunity within which to act. And so I'm hoping that, and by the way, the 30 by 30 has been embraced by the Biden administration. And if you haven't heard about it as it relates to new initiatives being taken from a conservation standpoint by the Biden administration, couched in 30-30, you're likely to hear about it more in the future. It's gaining a lot of traction around the world, and we think it's one of those things that holds great promise in terms of facilitating protection of these oh so important habitats, not only for our birds, but for ourselves. So that's big picture what's going on globally, and we all have a role to play. In Wisconsin, if we step things down a bit, there is an organization called the Wisconsin Bird Conservation Partnership, WIPCAP for short. And WIPCAP is an alliance of more than 180 organizations that are all working on behalf of bird conservation in Wisconsin. We have considered many ways in which to do conservation delivery. And what we have landed on is a construct that's called important bird areas. These are areas across the planet that have a high level of importance for bird conservation when compared to everything else that exists. This is a construct from the world's largest, one of the world's largest conservation organizations, BirdLife International, which is based in Cambridge, England. They actually started the important bird area, the IBA shorthand, the IBA program in Europe in 1985. It has since spread around the globe, and we have a robust and active IBA program, not only in the United States, but here in Wisconsin as well. To give you a feel for what IBAs are all about, so basically, we look at all of Wisconsin or all of the United States and say, where are those really important areas for birds? What are the habitats that are necessary in order to sustain not only migration, but populations? So we know essential habitats underpin the IBA designation. They're typically a mix of public and private lands. What I mean by that is most of the IBAs in Wisconsin have U.S. Forest Service ownership, Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources ownership, United States Fish and Wildlife Service ownership embedded within these areas that have been delineated as IBAs. But we also recognize that private lands, and this is especially important for the Northeast Wisconsin Land Trust efforts, private lands have a critically important role to play, especially since 85% of Wisconsin is privately owned. So if we really want to scale up conservation, if we want to have the impact that we need to have in order to save species and save habitats, there needs to be a very strong private lands conservation effort. IBAs are non-regulatory, so they get delineated on a map, but that does not have any binding restrictions for anyone who lives in or near an IBA. And even more important, they're voluntary. So if someone lives within an IBA and they don't support the concept of an IBA and what it stands for, that's just fine. What we hope is that people will learn, people who live in or near IBAs will begin to appreciate the importance of those areas and then want to do things in order to try to make those areas more robust ecologically and help protect the species, particularly the birds that depend on them for survival. So as I had mentioned, there are now more than 12,000 IBAs across the planet. It's really a remarkably important and successful system for directing limited conservation resources. This happens to be, by the way, a northern screamer, which is closely related sort of to a goose. This is about a turkey-sized bird that inhabits a number of IBAs in northern South America, including one in Colombia. And just as an anecdote, if you've never heard a northern screamer scream, I would suggest you can Google it online. I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to do it, but to hear one in the wild when you don't expect it is a life-changing experience. There are almost 3,000 IBAs in the United States. They range from the Copper River Delta up and on Alaska, which literally harbors hundreds of thousands of shorebirds during migration, to small sites like Wisconsin Point, Wisconsin Point, which is a small but important site in northern Wisconsin. So they can range from hundreds of thousands of acres to size to just a handful of acres, depending on the context and depending on what's happening within those areas habitat-wise. I had mentioned earlier that Wisconsin has a robust and active IBA program. We actually have 93 IBAs which have been designated across the state of Wisconsin. A number of years ago, we assembled our best bird biologists and our best conservationists and said, let's take a look at the state. Let's determine what's really important and let's identify those areas with an eye toward directing resources to them. And so that's what the Wisconsin Bird Conservation Partnership is now doing, is taking a look at this map. We recently completed a statewide assessment, in fact, the first in the nation of any state level important bird area program. And we're going to use the output from that assessment to begin to allocate resources to specific IBAs where we know partnerships have interest in expanding or accelerating conservation efforts within or adjacent to those very special sites. So let's take a quick look at Wisconsin now. And as we zero in on the Northeast Wisconsin Land Trust geography, we can begin to understand what's going on there. So here, as Kayla noted earlier, is your operational geography, with many, in fact, I think most of perhaps your sites that have been protected in one form or another that are identified. And I just want to go on record as saying Northeast Wisconsin Land Trust is one of the most significant land trusts in the state of Wisconsin. We, as a DNR partner with NEWLT, are very appreciative of the extensive efforts you had, extensive and effective and strategic, I might add, efforts that you undertake on a daily basis in order to protect the best habitats in northeastern Wisconsin. As it relates to IBAs, we know that the work you're doing along Green Bay is particularly important. And in fact, if we go back to that IBA map, within your operational geography, this constellation of IBAs starting up in the Peshtigo River and going then down the western shore of Green Bay into lower Green Bay is particularly important, not only for resident birds, but especially so for migratory birds. And the work you're doing there is really quite remarkable and is having a lasting impact on what's going on. So the Point Osebo-Wequiak wetland, coastal wetlands, just a gem of a site. I found this photo on the Cofran Biodiversity Center's website. It is a stunning place. I've not had the good fortune to bird there, but I do look forward to getting there at some point in not too distant future. The point here is that the work you're doing is contributing not only to conservation of birds in Wisconsin, but beyond. These sites ultimately are part of a constellation of important sites that span the Western Hemisphere that migratory birds rely on as they move back and forth on their annual cycles. Northward in the spring to Canada and the northern United States, southward in many instances all the way to Latin America in order to spend the winter. And they have to have these stepping stones in order to make those migratory journeys, which are in fact the most perilous part of any bird's annual life cycle. It's thought that more birds die during migration than at any other time of the year, just because of the hazards they encounter, like cats, like windows, like loss of habitat. So the issues, the challenges are pervasive across these birds' hemispheric ranges, and sites like this are vitally important for staving off extinction and for helping us to stabilize these declining bird populations. Kayla had mentioned earlier the Strawberry Island Marsh Preserve. While it's not a designated IBA, again, it's vitally important as a resource, not only for birds at a smaller scale to be using as a stopover site, some place where they stop to rest and refuel during migration, but it also provides public access. And as just a gem of a cattail marsh full of species that people can access, it's really essential in terms of making sure that we have meaningful connections to nature, because it's those meaningful connections then that translate ultimately into conservation action, be it by the individual or through support for the Northeast Wisconsin Land Trust. So what can we do to help birds then? We know these big issues are going on globally. We know that the Northeast Wisconsin Land Trust is doing an excellent job of protecting important habitats in the Northeast part of the state, but we also have a number of things that we as concerned citizens can do in order to try to help birds. And so I'm just going to rapidly go around this circle, around the halo of things we can do around this singing wood thrush, starting in the lower left and then going counterclockwise. Drink shade-grown coffee. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Reduce plastic use. That is self-explanatory. Do citizen science. Kayla is going to talk about that at the end of the presentation. Make your windows safe. Got another special slide on that because that's a really big deal and it's highly effective. Cats indoors, self-explanatory. I want to talk a little bit about using native plants, which is vitally important for a number of reasons. And then avoiding pesticides, which is also self-explanatory. So let's take a look at good grounds for conservation. It turns out that all coffee is not created equal. And in fact, the most important coffees from a conservation standpoint, and particularly those for migratory birds, are grown in the shade. So the best coffee is literally made in the shade. And what we want is to have a demand for shade-grown coffee grow in order to provide more habitat for birds in Latin America, because Latin America is facing much the same crisis that we are in terms of loss of habitat. It is the primary driver of species extinctions, both for resident birds in Central and South America and contributing significantly to the loss of our migratory birds. And by the way, of North America's about 700 or so species of birds, half spend the winter in Latin America. The same is true for Wisconsin. We have about 250, maybe a smidge less, of breeding birds. More than half of our 250 species of breeding birds depend on tropical habitats for survival. And if you look at the slide, sun coffee on the left looks like rows of corn. There is literally no habitat there. The native species, the native forests have been cleared, and you go into these full sun plantations, which are drenched in pesticides and drenched in fertilizers. They're very unhealthy environments, and they have almost no native or migratory species using them. It's a net loss of habitat, and that translates into negative impacts for species that need forest. On the other hand, look at the right side of the screen. This is a shade coffee plantation, and shade coffee plantations can be exceedingly rich for supporting biodiversity. Not only resident species, and of course, the New World tropics, the tropics of Latin America, harbor the highest concentrations of species on the planet, which includes our migratory birds. Shade-grown coffee plantations are literally full of migratory birds. I've seen it myself when I've had the good fortune to travel in the tropics. They're oh so important. This is an opportunity for us as consumers to drive conservation. So you can start every morning with a cup of conservation. When you go to the grocery store, look for something that's shade grown. Cats indoors, I just want to again emphasize the need to keep cats indoors. There are all sorts of horrible things that can happen to kitty when they're outside, including bringing back diseases, that some of which are transmissible to the owners, but it's just much safer for the cats. And look at how content this cat is laying in the sun. Now, who wouldn't want to be that cat or next to that cat on that cold November day? So please keep your cats indoors if you have cats. Good for birds, good for the kitty cats. Zen window curtains. So look, windows are an enormous deal. We moved into a house north of my wife and I live north of La Crosse in a largely wooded setting. And it's beautiful there and it's very birdy there. That's one of the reasons we moved there. But when we moved in, we didn't realize until we were about a month deep that that house, for the number of years, for the 30 years that it's been standing there, has been a bird killer in a big way. I was mortified by the number of really incredible birds that were dying on those windows when we moved in. And within a month, I put up these Zen window curtains. They're very easy to make. They're relatively easy to install, and they're maintenance free. They're aesthetically neutral. And what I want to share with you is that these window curtains, this kind of treatment where you take lengths of paracord and dangle it down in front of your window, breaks up the reflective surface, and birds are now not bouncing off our windows. They're not dying. Since we've put those up several years ago, we have had a couple of glances off windows, but zero bird mortality. So it's been darn near 100% effective. And this is something that anybody can do. So we have effectively transformed windows that were actively killing birds on an annual basis into being benign from a bird mortality standpoint, and it's really gratifying. We're saving a lot of birds just by not having them die in the windows. This is very inexpensive, very easy. I urge you to consider it if you have birds, and the birds that are actually boinking off your windows on a regular basis, and many of us do. And then finally, I think going native is oh so important. So there is research coming out now that indicates that the precipitous declines in insects of all things globally, and this is going on, and it's just come to light within the last 5 years or so, that there are catastrophic losses of insects. Those losses of insects are in turn helping to drive bird numbers down. So you can see these multiple factors that are all, again, conspiring to drive bird numbers down. One of the major contributors to insect loss, well, two of the major contributors to insect loss, one is rampant use of pesticides. So where we have the opportunity to eliminate, preferably, or reduce use of pesticides, that is a good thing for the planet. But what we're also finding out is native vegetation is extremely important for sustaining native insects. So what we know is as we go into suburban and urban environments, there is a tendency, and I've done this myself, there's a tendency to go to the nursery and pick out stuff that's really cool looking and come plant it in our yards. But if it's non-native, if it didn't originate in the upper Midwest, if you live in California and the vegetation didn't originate in California, you're basically planting ornaments that have very little ecological value. And what we're finding is that through the plantings of native vegetation in yards and parks and so on, we have literally sterilized our environments to the point where birds are no longer able to successfully reproduce in many urban habitats. What we know through empirical studies is that you have to have at least 70% native vegetation in your yard and in your neighbor's yard and in the park down the street and so on in order to sustain bird populations in urban and suburban areas. Less than 7 out of 10 plants in your yard being non-native, and the bugs aren't there. Those native caterpillars, those spiders, those beetles, all the things that this gray catbird and all of its avian cousins depend on to feed their babies in the spring, they simply can't find enough food. I've experienced that when we lived in the city of La Crosse in a largely non-native neighborhood. And I was seeing one baby catbird produced a year, or maybe 2 baby wrens. And it was so puzzling to me. I just didn't understand, because if a predator comes in to eat something, it eats all the babies. And yet there would be one baby that might fledge. And then as I began to look into the literature and put the pieces together, it occurred to me that, oh my gosh, they can't find anything to eat. So if they're having 4 babies and only 1 is surviving, the others are starving to death for lack of food. We completely nativized our yard in La Crosse. The response we got from birds was nothing short of astounding. And it was astounding in very rapid fashion. So planting native species for birds is very important for the conservation of all of the species that will be in your yard at some point. And most people experience amazing stuff, typically during migration, especially if you've planted. But it also helps support insect populations, which help maintain ecosystem function. So I can't overemphasize the importance of native species. If done right, it's beautiful, it's fun to do, it's a family activity, or even could be a neighborhood activity, and it can really add value to your property as well. So then those are a lot of things that we as individual landowners can do, or we as individual property owners can do, or consumers, in order to try to positively influence what's going on from a bird conservation standpoint. But even more to the point, and something I want to emphasize today is Northeast Wisconsin Land Trust, as I have said, has a critical role to play in conservation, not only in Northeast Wisconsin, but from a much broader perspective globally, because everything that's protected here, every acre that's protected either through fee acquisition or through easement is contributing to the conservation of species, to the function of vital ecosystems throughout the planet. And so what we know is, as Kayla mentioned, Northeast Wisconsin Land Trust has protected more than 6,000 acres. And the Land Trust efforts by those dedicated staff, driven in large part by the support that you as members are providing, is oh so important for helping to address these big global issues of extinction and climate change. And so I want to thank all of you for being able to muster the resources and to be able to dedicate the resources to make this land trust one of the best in the state of Wisconsin, one of the best in the upper Midwest. You're having a tremendous impact, and it is really important and very much appreciated. So with that, I want to say thanks, Northeast Wisconsin Land Trust, and all of you who helped make it happen. Keep going. The clock is ticking. We've got to make it happen. And we in the department look forward to continuing to collaborate with you in order to continue to protect those important habitats that not only define Wisconsin, but help with these much larger global issues that pose an existential threat to all of us. Together, we can literally put the kibosh on extinction. Well, in the end, it's really, from my perspective, all about the birds. And I think Dr. Thomas Lovejoy from George Mason University sums it up beautifully. If you simply take care of the birds, you take care of most of the big problems in the world. Thank you for your time this morning. I hope you learned something that you can apply from a conservation standpoint, and I'll be happy to take questions if you have them.
Thank you so much, Craig. What an amazing talk. Learned a lot, and completely agree with that last quote. If we take care of the birds, we take care of everything else. So at this point, we would like to open it up for questions. So if you do have a question, you're welcome to just type it into the chat, or you can unmute and speak your question verbally to Craig. But I see that there's already one question in the chat box. How can someone find out what coffee brands or types are shade grown? Is there a certification that they should look for, or a website they can go to? Do you have any insight on that, Craig?
Yes, so it's a great question. And one of the conundrums of shade grown coffee is its difficulty to find. So it's not often that you walk into a grocery store somewhere and a big sign that says, and here's the shade grown. So what Mary and I have had to do is put a little bit of effort into finding it, but we have found a source that is good for us. It's called Birds and Beans. So if you simply Google Birds and Beans coffee, or better yet, Google, so look at Birds and Beans and decide whether that's something that you have interest in. But if you Google shade grown coffee, you're going to get a variety of sources that come up that will provide you opportunities to consider different brands, different flavors, and so on. In regard to how do you know if it's shade grown or not, you want to look for one of two certification systems. The first is the Rainforest Alliance. So they have a little symbol that's called, the rainforest frog, and their mantra is follow the frog. So if the Rainforest Alliance has their little seal on a package, that means that according to their certification system, this coffee is shade grown. The gold standard within the industry for certified coffee is with the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Institute. And in fact, if you really want to get into the nitty gritty of what shade grown coffee is all about and how the certification actually is applied in certain situations, you can Google Smithsonian Migratory Bird Institute shade-grown coffee program. And they have a small symbol on their packages of coffee that say bird friendly. And so, for instance, the Birds and Beans coffee that Mary and I buy, and we give it as gifts as well, just to try to promote shade coffee consumption, is certified as bird friendly. And they have a very rigorous certification system, which is paying great dividends in terms of putting habitat on the ground and helping to sustain local economies. And when we have that marriage of habitat protection driven by economic incentive, that's exactly what we're trying to achieve, because the locals then are going to bat not only for themselves economically, which makes perfect sense, in fact, that's necessary, but they're protectors of the environment, they're producers of environmentally sustainable products. And so shade-grown coffee can have a tremendous impact. It's just a little hard to find, so Google it, and once you find a product that you like, you're in. And then you can just continue to do that. And I encourage you to share it with friends as well and family.
Great, thank you, Craig, for those resources and those certifications to look for. Since we were chatting yesterday, I checked my coffee this morning, and I'm a fan of Caribou Coffee, our local Midwestern brand, and it is Rainforest Alliance certified. So I felt pretty good about that.
Excellent. And
that's options this morning. So I encourage you guys to go check your coffee before you consume tomorrow.
That's a great example, Kayla.
Craig, we had a few other questions from the chat box, so maybe I'll just go through them one by one.
Okay.
If anybody is listening to this and wants to chime in, please do. The first was, do you have any thoughts about adding bird feeders and bird houses to gardens?
Yes, I have bird feeders and they're great fun. So here's the conventional wisdom on bird feeders. In terms of influencing bird populations, their impact is minimal to non-existent. They probably have an impact when we had that really nasty cold snap in February. For birds that are coming into feeders, I am quite confident they are helping those birds survive those protracted bouts of cold weather. So I think locally they probably help birds, but big term conservation wise, it's a neutral impact. That said, I think that anything that makes people enjoy birds and fosters those kinds of connections that develop a strong advocacy for birds is really good. And so Mary and I just simply enjoy feeding birds and watching them. And we've seen amazing things come into our feeders. And so we do it because it's fun. And so not much conservation impact, but a great way for people to connect to nature, which then by extension leads to conservation impact. Bird houses, a little different. I'm reading some information that's coming out now that's saying, and don't get me wrong, I love house wrens, but they are a pugnacious little bird.
Yeah,
and house wrens, I see some nodding heads. House wrens have a tendency to evict all of the other neighbors in cavities. So if chickadees are nesting, they want the chickadees out. If there are tufted titmice that are nesting, they want the tufted titmice gone, and so on. And so they might, kind of put up a tussle with other birds. They might go in and puncture eggs. I think the conventional wisdom is suggesting for things like house wrens that, it's a mixed bag. If you want to do it and have a pair of house wrens, I guess, I don't think there's a huge harm in that. But if you're putting out a lot of house wren houses, that may have an impact on other bird populations. On the other hand, bluebirds are almost exclusively dependent on bluebird houses now. Tree swallows are increasingly dependent on bluebird houses. Lots of wood duck populations have rebounded because of wood duck box programs, as have hooded mergansers and so on. So depending on the species, you can have a very positive impact conservation-wise. You just have to do a little bit of background research on what it means to be putting boxes out. And then you have to be willing to maintain those boxes. That's vitally important.
Another question from the chat box. Do you have a source for the Zen window shades?
Yes, thank you. Great question. Here's what you can do. Google www.birdsavers.com. And that's going to take you to what is to a website that in the trades is known as the Acopian. That's the trade name, ACOPIAN, Bird Savers. So it's www.birdsavers.com will take you to the Acopian Bird Savers webpage, and they will have examples of these Zen curtains, and you can either order from them, but they also provide a tutorial as to how to make them yourself. And I thought that'd be easier, and it was great fun to do that for us. So again, easy, effective. So that's the best source of that information.
We had another question about if you could say something about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and I didn't get the full question, but maybe the person who left the question can chime in as well.
Have to type it in.
I think they were asking specifically how the changes in interpreting the Migratory Bird Treaty Act under the last administration have affected birds over the past 4 years, if you have any insight on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, it is an act it is a federal law which protects migratory birds in general from harm and harassment, from killing them in any respect or harassing them in any respect. And it has been an effective law for reducing impacts to birds, particularly associated with things like mining or oil extraction. That some of the big extractive industries out west have had impacts on migratory birds for a variety of reasons. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act is a federal law that has helped minimize those impacts. And it's the presence of that law that is the driving force to ensure that people and industries come into compliance. There was an effort afoot to reinterpret the application of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in the Trump administration. That did not quite make it out to the streets before the Biden administration took office. And so the Biden administration has put a stay on that change. And so what we're anticipating is that the Migratory Treaty Act and the full force of the Migratory Treaty Act will continue unchanged as we move into the later years now of the Biden administration. So there was an effort to kind of roll it back and weaken it, and that effort has been reversed by the Biden administration. So on balance, from a functional standpoint, no change.
Another quick question, Craig. Do you have any favorite birds that migrate through Wisconsin to the tropics?
Wow, yes, all of them. I bet many of you are as well. I'm completely smitten with birds. Even the little dull things now make me happy. I'm just so happy to see birds. But so just a couple of examples. Again, we live next to this really big block of woods. We're very fortunate, and we see amazing things come into our yard. So every year we have yellow-billed cuckoos that are very secretive. They're just a cool bird. They're big and they're neat looking. They winter south of the Amazon basin in South America. And when I see yellow-billed cuckoos come back, I just go, oh my gosh, how did they make it all the way back across the Amazon, through the Andes, weaving up through Central America to get to the Yucatan Peninsula, then literally crossing the Gulf of Mexico in one flight, 500 miles of open water nonstop. That is, for a bird with a tailwind, an 18-hour journey. So if you can imagine, once they're up and flying over the Gulf, they're committed, because if they stop flapping, they die. So they've got to get to the Gulf shore of Louisiana and Texas in order to complete the next phase of their journey. And then they have to dodge all those hazards we talked about in order to get to our yard in Wisconsin. So, and the same is true for Baltimore Orioles, for rose-breasted grosbeaks, for any of the flycatchers, for virtually all of the warblers, and so on and so forth. So anytime I see an oriole, it's entirely possible that oriole spent the winter in Costa Rica in the company of howler monkeys. And I look at them and go, oh my gosh, you made it back. I'm so thrilled. I do want to point out another favorite, and then I'll stop. Another favorite is scarlet tanager, which is this spectacular woodland bird that's you see it and you almost have to put sunglasses on. It's such bright red with deep black wings. That's a bird that winters on the west slope of the Andes from Venezuela down through Peru. And it's an area, because of coffee culture, and particularly sun coffee culture, that is losing forest rapidly. And so what's going on in terms of our consumption of sun coffee is literally diminishing habitat for our scarlet tanagers. And so there are fewer coming back every year. But back to the point is when I see a scarlet tanager, I just think, oh my gosh, how did you make it back? It's a miracle, and it's such a moving thing. They're just so spectacular. And I am so grateful every year to be able to see them. So those are a few highlights, and I suspect that all of you, if not in your yard, then in your city park or in your nearby state park, or whatever the case may be, can see these incredible long distance migrants as they move back and forth every year. Oh, by the way, one more, ruby-throated hummingbird, just to knock out winters from southern Mexico down through western Panama. How does a little bird that weighs less than a dime fly across the Gulf of Mexico nonstop? It's a miracle. In fact, somebody calculated that, so birds burn body fat as fuel. That's like, so they need to put on a lot of body fat in order to make these arduous journeys. And somebody calculated that if our cars burn gasoline as efficiently as a hummingbird burns body fat on these long distance journeys, our cars would get about 450,000 miles to the gallon. It's an interesting statistic.
Wow.
Thank you for sharing, Craig. I love seeing your enthusiasm. I myself saw my first scarlet tanager last summer at a state park in Iowa along the Mississippi River, and it is just, you see it and you don't think it's real. It is so incredible. So thank you for sharing.
Congratulations and good for you.
Thank you. I think we've covered all the questions. I think that might be a really good point to transition to our next slide, which is an opportunity for all of you to participate in citizen science and really get out there and just see birds and share about it so that scientists can continue to learn and study and protect these amazing creatures. So Stephanie, I think you're on the line. Would you like to share a little bit more about the eBird app?
Oh gosh, Kayla, thank you. I have a really poor connection here today, but I would just encourage people to check it out. I have not even used it yet, but I'm really excited to. So I know we have some birders in our group. Anybody else want to chime in, they can. On the slide you see there is a bit of information about it. I hope the link is there. If it's not, maybe Kayla could post the link to downloading the eBird app. There's also a sort of partner app called Merlin that is a bird identifier app. So I think all of us that want to advance bird habitat and conservation for birds, if we become birders, it will be a great add to the cause. Thanks, Kayla.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stephanie. The Merlin app in combination with the eBird app is a really fun combination. So you can be out there birding, pull up the Merlin app and figure out what kind of birds you're seeing. And then you can go into eBird and you can actually log those birds, like how many eagles you saw, how many cardinals you saw, where you saw them. And then that goes into this big database that scientists can access, and we can really, all of us can be citizen scientists and contribute to the well-being of these birds. So you can go to any app store. If you have an Apple phone, go to the Apple App Store. If you have an Android phone, go to your respective app store. You can download that Merlin and eBird app and just take that along next time you go birding, and hope you have some fun with it. So with that, I'd just like to thank all of you for joining today. Thank you so much, Craig, for your excellent presentation. And we just thank all of you for your support of the Northeast Wisconsin Land Trust. We are a nonprofit member-supported organization, and we could not do the work that we do without all of you and your passion for land. So thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you all in person sometime soon, but I hope you can get out there today and enjoy the warm weather and see some of our bird friends out in the wild. So thank you all. With that, we'll close out the meeting, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Linda, do you want to stop the recording?
I just want to say it was fabulous, you guys. Thank you, thank
Stephanie.
you. Thank you,
for
Kayla.
joining.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Craig, if you're still there. Bye.
Oh, thanks so much for joining us, Stephanie. Bye, everyone. Kayla, can you stay on 1 minute after our folks leave?
Sure. Do you want me to stop the recording or do you have it?
I'll stop it now.
Okay.